Hello, my name is Eagle Valiant Brosi. I have a book coming out this week on Tuesday, June 17th, 2025. It's called Black COHOSH. Here it is. Here is the pictures of it. And I wanted to make this video to talk more about my motivation and the context of the book. I wanted to write a book about having a speech impediment, because I felt like I didn't like some of the media depictions of speech impediments in the past, and I felt like there was nothing I could really relate to, we have all these depictions of speech impediments in the media, sort of. You have, in South Park, you have Kenny, but Kenny is expendable. He can die every episode. In Charlie Brown, the adults are muffled because what they're saying doesn't matter. In classic movies like The Princess Bride, the speech impediment of the preacher is depicted as like a joke, right? The preacher says we're gathered for marriage, and he can't, the preacher in The Princess Bride can't say his R's, so everyone's laughing at him, and he's like this big joke, right? Because if you have a speech impediment, you can't have a job where you talk in public. And it's kind of like, doesn't this doofus know that he's not supposed to be talking in public? Like, how could you be so dumb, you stupid preacher? Like, you can't be a preacher. You can't say your R's. And, as someone who has problems saying their R's, I don't know if I can say marriage the right way, or if I say it the way the preacher does in that movie. It's scary for me to see it. And it's also like, it's strange, right? Because some people, they love that movie, and their childhood is aligned with that movie, and you can't say a bad word about it. So it's this like strange kind of thing. And so I wanted to write about being a kid with a speech impediment. And like, I think it's important that I say this now, which is that while I talk off in front of you, when I was a kid, it was a much more significant issue. I've gotten this way after years of speech therapy and years of me recording myself and listening back and trying to fix myself the way that I talk. But when I was a kid, I was nearly completely indecipherable. And I don't think anyone really could understand what I was saying. And because of that, in this book, my central character talks in glyphs and symbols. I do this kind of weird gimmick where no one can understand what he says. And it's actually like, I've drawn comics for a while, and it's very hard to draw a comic where, you write out the speech bubble and you don't put in letters in that. And then if you're going to have a character who can't talk, it's very tempting to put in a thought bubble. Or it's very tempting to put something like Meanwhile in the Batcave. And so I wanted to write a book where that didn't happen. There is no thought bubbles. There is no Meanwhile at the Batcave. There's no exposition written out. There's nothing like that. And my central character talks in a way that no one can understand. So those were my chief motivations in writing the book. But then the thing about it is that in talking about having a speech impediment, I had to start talking about my childhood. And my childhood was different than most people's. So my parents were what they would call themselves back to the landers, which is kind of an off branch of hippies that predates the hippies. But yeah, so my parents, they wanted to like live their politics, and in 1960s America, my parents were born in 1942. I was not born in the 60s or 70s. My parents started living kind of in this back to the land style. So by the time that I came along, they were pretty well established in it, you know, where we gardened and we canned and we mended clothes, and we kind of lived in this kind of outdated by society's standards way of life. And, you know, I used to think that they were living their politics when I was, you know, getting older and trying to figure out why we did these things. But actually, what I've now realized is that they retreated from society and they tried to remake the American family because they were coming from places of trauma. And their trauma was different from each other's. And so, you know, I wanted to kind of explore that and figure that out, you know. Find out what was going on exactly with that. And, you know, yeah. So, you know, I had these pretty extreme hippie parents. And my pretty extreme hippie parents, they felt like there were all these people out to get them. They had a friend who was killed, and they told me that the reason why their friend was killed was because they were a hippie. My dad had been involved in some activist organizations, and he was constantly worried about his FBI file in regards to his anti-war and civil rights movement activism that was maybe overblown by him. And, you know, they had other friends who were like dumpster diving hippies, and they had this idea in their head that some redneck or someone on the right wing of things had seen these hippies dumpster diving in one particular dumpster, and the guy had thrown antifreeze on all the food in that dumpster. So when the hippies went to dumpster dive it, they all got sick. And so they had this kind of sense that all these people are out to get us. And they would tell us all these people are out to get us. And because my parents didn't feel like they should mend the way they talked to me, that they should shelter me in any way, they felt like adult problems were the child's problems too. But honestly, it scared me. It scared me a lot. And so, you know, this book takes place when I'm in middle school. And I guess because I had a severe speech impediment, and people couldn't understand what I was saying, it was difficult for me to learn how to read. I returned to public school in middle school, but for 4th and 5th grade, I was homeschooled. Basically, what happened is after the 3rd grade, my mom realized that I didn't know how to read. And I think that the reason why I got to be the age of 11 or 12 without knowing how to read is that no one could understand what I was saying. And so when you're teaching a young kid to read, you sit there next to them and you ask the kid to read to them. And, you know, if you can't understand what the kid is saying, how do you teach that kid to read? Also, like, the way that they tried to teach me to read was phonically, sounding out the words. And obviously, because I can't sound out words correctly, right? I can't even say the word correctly, or the vowel sounds or anything like that. How am I supposed to learn to read if I don't know the sounds, right? So my mom pulled me out of school for 4th and 5th grade, and she would teach me to read by memorization. And so we used the William S. Gray Dick and Jane novels. And for those who don't know Dick and Jane novels, it's brother and sister, very 1950s conformist America. Dick and Jane do all these repetitive actions. So, Dick will walk up the hill. Jane will walk up the hill. Dick will walk down the hill, then walk back up it. There will be a ball that gets thrown up the hill and down the hill. So by the time you've heard hill 7 or 6 times, you've memorized the way that hill looks. So when this book takes place, I have this kind of, I'm a hippie. I'm in Eastern Kentucky. And I've only been reading for like half a year, and no one can understand what I'm saying. So I have all these things working against me. And the kids in middle school are like, they're mean to me. And it's unclear to me on whether or not they're mean to me because of me as who I am, if they're mean to me because I'm a hippie, and hippies are supposed to be, are openly persecuted against, according to my parents, and all this other stuff, right? And so my character is trying to navigate this, and this is not giving much away at all, but early in the book, my character, me, I went out to the mailbox, just like I did when I was a kid, and I got this anonymous letter, and this happened in real life. I got this anonymous letter that said, I'm going to burn your house down. And I didn't know if it was the bullies, if it was like anti-hippie right-wingers, or if it was something else entirely. But I remember thinking that it was the people who were bullying me, and not wanting to show my parents because I wanted to hide it from them. And I remember staying up all night long, basically, and I was so worried, and I was so freaked out that these people were going to come and they were going to burn the house down, and then I was going to have to rebuild the house, and how horrible that was going to be, and if even we survived or something. I just was completely mortified, paralyzed with terror that I had done this thing, because I had kind of, after a certain point in time with the bullies, I was kind of maybe standing up for myself a little bit against them by bullying them back. And so that's kind of the setup of this book. But I want to talk briefly about this because it's weird to say, because, when people assume about, oh, there's this person and they didn't know how to read, you assume all these stuff, but like my family was hyper literary, right? My dad was an adjunct English professor for most of my life. He's retired now. And he had a bookstore when before the internet came, right? And he had this brick and mortar bookstore that he had all these books in, and the bookstore only sold books by Appalachian writers, or they were written about Appalachia, and all this other stuff. And when the internet came and basically put an end to that, my dad started you know, traveling to different places, traveling to book festivals, and you know, there would be book festivals, there would be Appalachian crafts festivals, there would be Appalachian festivals in general, and then there were also a lot of people who came to Eastern Kentucky to get away from the city and finish their novels, right? So there were a lot of writing workshops that were happening around the state, and particularly in Eastern Kentucky, because, you know, it's a great way to get away from everything if you just want to completely detach. You know, you go to where there's no cell phone service. You go to where there's only dial-up internet. And so people were coming to Eastern Kentucky to write these books, and my dad was selling them books, which, you know, as I'm sure you can imagine, the people who were teaching the classes and the people who were trying to write their books, they wanted to read books. So it was a pretty good situation. And so after my dad working this bookstore situation and also, you know, going to these writing workshops, he eventually became part-time the editor for a literary magazine called Appalachian Heritage. It's now called the Appalachian Review. Yeah, he became the editor for it. And what that meant was that for his quarterly magazine, he would bring home the slush pile. And, you know, even though, you know, I had hardly been reading at all, he was a slow reader, and he couldn't make it through all the manuscripts. So he'd like come home and he would throw down all the poetry and short story and essay submissions that he hadn't gone through and asked us to go through them. And so we would spend some nights, you know, going through these slush piles of manuscripts. And I was trusted, I don't know why, to have an opinion about these things. And, you know, if I liked something, I would put it aside. And if I didn't like it, I would put it over in the reject pile. And, you know, they would screen out the people who they felt like they had to publish, right? The famous people. They would always, you know, screen out before it got to me. But if you were some no-name, you could have been, you know, your manuscript submission could have been, you know, rejected by a pretty young, pretty kid who hadn't spent that long reading. The other thing about this is about Appalachian Heritage is that after a while, I think my dad got kind of bored of doing it. So he would embark on these kind of weird ideas of being like, for this issue, we're going to focus on one thing. In this issue, it was the Cherokee in Appalachia. And so he'd actually go about, and this is interesting to me, but he would, you know, and for this one, he translated the text to Cherokee. So he'd have the Cherokee text on one side, and then the American text on the other side. Which is like an interesting, you know, kind of thing to do. Because the reason why he got bored, though, is because it's Appalachian Heritage, right? This is the reason why they probably changed it to Appalachian Review. We were getting a lot of essays and a lot of poetry about people's iron skillets and people's quilts and how amazing their grandma was. And then there was also like this kind of weird thing where these guys would write out this hyper-violent historical fiction about the Civil War, right? So, you know, that movie Cold Mountain. They would be writing out like a Cormac McCarthy kind of manuscript that was mimicked Cold Mountain, which is not, it was never that great. Now, we did have good submissions from time to time, but, you know, there was a lot of Appalachian Heritage, right? that I wasn't that interested in, to be honest with you. Because of course, my own hippie heritage was at some points in time in conflict with the Appalachian heritage. So this weird thing happened though, which is after a little while of him being this editor, the college where he was running the quarterly out of, they hired this woman named Bell Hooks. And this is a book by Bell Hooks, When Angels Speak of Love. It's poems. And Bell Hooks is a black woman from northern Kentucky. For those of you who don't know, she wrote a lot about the confluence of capitalism and race, and of course, capitalism and gender, and where all three of those things meet, right? And so she's of some notoriety. I believe if you go to take a women's studies course, you'll probably should hopefully read some amount of Bell Hooks in that course. But so, Bell Hooks moves to my town of, she's got this kind of fame and this notoriety about her. And, she, all these people wanted to catch Bell's eye. And so suddenly, Appalachian heritage is a lot less heritage, and people are submitting manuscripts and submitting poems and submitting essays and things like that have the Bell Hooks kind of tint to them, right? They all stories about being queer, stories about being a minority. We suddenly had minority writers submitting to us when predominantly it was white people. And so she really kind of changed the shape of it. And, it was interesting to me because, people in Eastern Kentucky and people in Kentucky in general, they don't like it when people come from outside of the region and try to articulate the region, right? We've had a lot of people who, want to depict Eastern Kentucky, Appalachian people as, inbred and all kinds of just gross, violent individuals. And they think that a lot of that is coming from outside the region. You still find things today where people will travel from New York and go to like West Virginia and be like, we talked to Trump voters in West Virginia. And it's like, you have Trump voters in New York. You don't have to go to West Virginia to find them. They have this, it's almost like the media wants to depict Appalachia as Sparta, whereas the rest of the country is like Athens, right? And Sparta, they're all warlike and they don't know about democracy, but, they're less than, they're violent, they're stupid. So the reason why I talk about this is because Belle was from northern Kentucky and she moved to eastern Kentucky, and she could immediately articulate what it was like to be living in eastern Kentucky within minutes. And she was just so much smarter than everyone else that she could articulate it better than everyone else. And so me as a, young girl, seeing this kind of respect from Belle, I was trying to read some Bell Hooks. And it's embarrassing to admit this, but so Belle's talking, she's talking about capitalism, she's talking about race, she's talking about gender. And the lexicon Belle uses was always kind of like voices. She talks about marginalized voices a lot. And my searching for some kind of meaning of things, I felt like when I first started reading one of her books and it was over my head and I hadn't had like any kind of information or anything. I thought she was writing about literal voices, and I was thinking that she was writing about having a speech impediment, which is so funny because, you know, it's just a weird thing for your mind to do. You're searching so hard for meaning and stuff. And then, of course, you know, I think that first book I was reading, it was called Killing Rage. You know, Bell Hooks didn't just write about love, she wrote about rage too. And in Killing Rage, she says, you know, when people talk of race and violence, it's always white male voices that speak up the loudest. And I remember getting to that point and being like, oh, like these voices that she's talking about, they're not about, it's not about that. It's not a speech impediment. You know, it's not as literal as I was taking it. So yeah, I think that once I read that part of Killing Rage, you know, even I ignored what Belle was saying, which is, you know, we've heard a lot of white men talk. Like, let's have somebody else talk about something. It made me want to actually write a book about the little, you know, and I want to be careful here. I mean, like, literally marginalized voice of, not to say my voice is always marginalized at all, but having the voice that is not phonically correct. Which is a weird way of putting things, but anyway, yeah. And you know, Belle was friends with my parents because, of course, they were. Because you know, my parents were literary, and my book is seemingly about my mom. And so, what's weird to say about this is that, you know, Belle Hooks and my mom were kind of buddies, you know, and she's saying, "Hey, Connie," you know, and I think she says, "What a joy to know you," from Belle, which is like a weird kind of thing I want to end it on, to say. Yeah, so books are always important to my family and to especially my mom. And here was this book, Black COHOSH, that's not just about speech impediments. It's also about hippies, and it's about the worry of violence, about bad dads and moms, maybe bad moms, maybe good moms. It's hard to say. And there's a bunch of other stuff in there too. But I hope that this has greater context to the book. Thank you for listening.